Okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. Hopefully, we're live. Hopefully, everything's working. So, this is by and large a follow up to a series of previous videos. So, I have to say that in these videos, I have to be fairly superficial, right? So, this is kind of an interesting notion, right? So, I mentioned how I don't use Twitter because I don't think there's a single thought I can express in this short span. I need at least an hour. But honestly, an hour is a gross underestimate. I think that if you want to express any idea in politics, you need a course. You need a course because or maybe several courses, because every word needs to be defined. And there was an interesting question from somebody about interest. Interest. What counts as interest? From Andrei. Someone they asked about interest, and I want to talk about that because after Darwin, after Nietzsche, after Freud, the notion of interest is a bit problematic. As I like to say, human beings are anxious and mostly unconscious products of larger forces of biological and cultural evolution, manufactured by those forces, not to be happy, not to achieve their interest, not even to know their interest, but human beings are manufactured by those forces to fulfill a certain function within the logic of perpetuation of those systems, right? And usually I end by saying in this Heideggerian Lacanian fashion that we want things that we don't really need, and the things that we really need are the ones that we in principle cannot get. So, maybe you can think of Schopenhauer if you want to understand what I mean by this phrase. So let me start somewhere, and we'll see how it goes. So my plan. Again, this is unscripted, zero preparation on my part, so hopefully, we'll see how it goes. So the plan is to talk about interest, talk about obligation, go back to my picture about ideal types, and actually also a word about general will, which I think is a very important notion from Rousseau, and I feel it's a very important skill of future political philosophers to be able to understand what general will means, and not to just think, oh, it's some kind of totalitarian lie. It could be, but not necessarily. That's the important bit. Also, maybe let me add this to the slide conflict and consensus, because I keep talking in all the keep discussing about this common interest, and it's like, again, when I was younger, and for me, in many ways, this is the starting position of any philosophy course. This question of conflict and consensus. When I was younger, I guess, like when I was a child, I grew up in a certain kind of environment, especially, it's a very shame. I don't want to say shameful. It's a very banal thing to say. But my grandmother had a big influence on me when I was a child, and she kind of taught me that the world was a good place, that the government took care of people, like an essentially this vision of consensus, and in later years in school, and especially earlier years in the university, I was shocked when I began to do sort of my own research, broadly speaking, right? And seeing how abusive human beings actually are. The history of humanity, I think, can be safely summarized as history of injustice and violence. Anything. It's like, take wars, take prisons, concentration camps. I have to remind that sort of it's a very strange thing to associate concentration camps with, let's say, the Nazi Germany. Concentration camps were used very widely outside of this context. I mean, during the American Civil War, or the British deployed them, in South Africa, and it's like probably one of the most horrific examples in the history of the world is maybe Belgian Congo. And again, like, I'm not a historian. I'm not trying to give you a definitive list of the worst atrocities in the history of humanity. But it's like history of humanity is pretty bad. Or if you think about, it's like think about how in the 90s, in the Soviet bloc, as the Soviet countries were collapsing, how were children treated in orphanages, right? And then you say, oh, but there's obligation, there's goodness, there's categorical imperative. You should never lie, and let's say, you should give up driving your car for the sake of the environment. You see? It's like Hegel has this notion of Pöbel, the rabble. That there are people who, again, it's not a question of individual morality. It's a question of structural problems Systematic problems need systematic solutions. There are people who are oppressed by society, who are exploited by society, and they do not feel that they benefit from being members of society at all. Hegel says you cannot expect these people, basically the homeless, right, or those children I'm talking about now in orphanages, right, in society which is collapsing, who sometimes were horribly mistreated. Again, I don't want to upset anybody, but you feel free to do your own research. And again, unfortunately, these kinds of examples are more like the norm rather than exception. So I'm not making any. I have no illusions on this part, and I have to keep reminding, right? So our society tends to be very conflictual, but then there's a possibility of Hegelian Rechtsstaat, which is consensus. There's a possibility of Marxian communism, which is consensus. There's a possibility of Rousseauian general rule, which is consensus. There's a possibility of Mill and Habermas free and equal discussion. A possibility. I'm not saying it's here. I'm not saying it's real. Although, again, I'm sure some countries are closer, some countries are further away from this ideal. So anyway, so I was gonna. It's like I'm sort of digressing, but let me try to bring this somewhere. So I talked last time. Well, actually, let me maybe find my slide about obligation. Not entirely sure. Yeah, well, maybe. Well, actually, yeah. This was my slide about obligation from last time. So you see, again, the natural law, natural rights tradition, people like Locke and Kant, they would talk about these intrinsic values in nature, and very importantly, this notion of unconditional obligation, that you are obliged to do certain things no matter what. It's like Locke says, no one ought to harm another in his life, liberty, health, or possession. In fact, he says, we ought, as much as we can, to preserve everything, our fellow human beings, but also animals and also trees, because everything is God's work, says Locke. And we are under an obligation, unconditional obligation to God to preserve all of that. And it's a nice story. It sounds nice, but again, I don't think it works for so many reasons. I don't think it's uncontroversial whether God exists. I don't think it's uncontroversial what kind of, even if you believe that God exists, what kind of morality does God or gods preach? There's an interesting question, Euthyphro. It's a very, very famous dialogue about Euthyphro, where Socrates talks to this person, Euthyphro. Basically, Socrates, in some sense, tries to argue that even if gods existed and had certain wishes, the fact that they are gods does not make their wishes automatically moral. Socrates insists that there has to be a higher standard of morality. So this is against the divine command theory. Anyway, so I think that the natural law tradition doesn't work. So what we have, on the other hand, the alternative is the emotivist, again, this constructivist tradition, right? So there are no natural values, and therefore it means that all obligation has to be conditional. You see? So when I say that all obligation has to be conditional, the idea is that, so this is all from last time. The idea is that you can be obliged to do certain things only in terms of, what Kant calls hypothetical imperative. If you want A, then you are obliged to do B. Then you are obliged to do B. So for example, Hobbes says, if you want to survive, you have to obey the sovereign, right? But you do not have an unconditional obligation to the sovereign for Hobbes, right? Humans are conscious beings. Everything we do for some good to ourselves. So ultimately, obligation has to be grounded in our interest. And if we had no common interest, then society would be impossible. But it is only because you have an interest and I have an interest and we have a common interest, so individual interest. And then the sum of individual interests, we have common interests. This is how society is possible. This is how this is how political obligation is possible. Even in Hegel, at the end of the day, you are obliged to obey the Rechtsstaat for many reasons, but one reason that Hegel singles out is because actually being, this Aristotelian ideal, being a member of a well-ordered society is in your interest. And again, it's a complicated thought. Students don't understand it very often, and I need several lectures with many examples to explain it. But hopefully these words at least do some justice to that. I wanted to stress this. That I believe that all obligation is always conditional. It's conditional upon your interest. So let's talk about what is interest. So you see, this is the interesting problem, right? Because we begin with this, again, anti-natural law tradition. We begin by saying that everything, with Hobbes says that everything is chaos of matter in motion. Chaos of matter in motion. So nothing is good or evil in and of itself. Whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is it which he, for his part, calls good, and of his hate and aversion, evil. There being nothing, simply and absolutely so. Right? So this is Hobbes. Mill is going to say, David Hume is going to say this, John Stuart Mill is going to say this, and this is also my reading of Nietzsche, and this is also my reading. So I insist that this is the right reading of Hobbes and Mill, but this is also my reading of Nietzsche, and this is also my reading of Marx. And I remind you again that I read Marx through the prism of Nietzsche, and I read Nietzsche through the prism of Marx. Now, so what we have is basically Nietzsche is here for a reason. This is the death of, like in Hobbes, we see death of God before Nietzsche. So Hobbes discovers the death of God. So in Hobbes before Nietzsche. Hobbes discovers the death of God before Nietzsche will discover the death of God. Nothing is good or evil in and of itself. Morality is artificial. Morality is artificial. Can I fit this? I wonder. Sorry. Yeah. So again. So morality is artificial. And again, it's like we construct it because we have this free and equal discussion, and there's an element. Social contract is wrong, broadly speaking, for human reasons, because it's not that. Contract is the basis of society. Contract is not the basis of society. Society is the basis of the contract. But still, within this tradition, there's a certain contractual element. I would say even in Hegel and even in Marx, in the sense that again, you obey, but you obey freely. And this is the contractual element. You obey freely because it's in your interest. In the ideal case, again, sometimes if you imagine Belgian Congo, again, the poor Congolese were, tortured and forced on the fear of physical mutilation, right? To work. That's not a vision of consensus. So I understand. And it's like, you see, for Marx, capitalism is by and large not a vision of consensus. We live in a society which is horribly broken in all sorts of ways, right? But there's a possibility. This is a conflictual reality, but there's also a consensual possibility. So anyway, so let me talk about interest a little bit. So you see, the problem is that maybe I should switch forward to the next slide, and then I'll come back. So I've had this slide right last time. The slide basically that sort of this is ideal type of there's a typology of action, right? And this is typology of authority. What constitutes legitimate authority? Why do we obey? And why do we do things? So free and equal discussion, presumably, this is based on rational calculation, like rational calculation of self-interest. Rational cal. I understand that I haven't defined interest yet. Right? Patrimonialism is again, you are forced to obey. And this may also ultimately be in your self-interest, but it's a compromise. Right? So as Thrasymachus says, or Callicles say, think of Thrasymachus and Callicles, justice is just the interest of the stronger. That in every country, in every society, there's the stronger party, or maybe the more numerous party, who force others to obey against their interest. This is patrimonialism. Well, is it 100%? Is this what Thrasymachus and Callicles is talking about? No, not necessarily, but I feel that there's a certain affinity, right? So capitalism, very interesting. We're talking about curse of laws of competition in the market. And again, like we keep talking about animal welfare, we keep talking about nature conservation. And it's like on the one hand, I want to be pedagogical. I'm pointing to the Buddha. I feel that there's a certain value in not starting flame wars, in talking to people respectfully and open-mindedly. But on the other hand, I feel that there's no two ways around it. Capitalism is the blight on the human condition, right? On the human society. Animals are tortured, environment is destroyed, and maybe more importantly, human lives are destroyed. And the poor workers are oppressed, and the rich bourgeoisie is alienated. Okay, so and everybody suffers, everybody is worse off, right? Because of capitalism. We are not 100% in capitalism, but we're mostly in capitalism, right? And I feel that there's like no way we're going to solve this in any other fashion. Again, also like this is where people begin to get upset, but it's just I mentioned last time. So when we talk about animal welfare, when we talk about common interest, again, you see, everything has an environmental footprint. I mean, I am recording this talk. I'm using a microphone, right? I am, I'm using a monitor, a camera, right? So all this stuff is assembled in China probably by people who work less than decent wages, and the raw materials for this stuff, especially if you think of this was recently in the news. Again, I'm not an expert on this stuff. You look this up. That some of the rare earth metals are mined literally by children in Africa in absolutely horrific conditions. So it's like if I were to tell you, you know what, meat is murder. It's like I feel that there's literally blood on my hands from talking into this microphone, and it would be the height of hypocrisy for me to tell you that meat is murder, because it's like the capitalist system is abusive and destructive of humans, of the environment, and of animals, right? And it's like we need to be smart about protecting the environment. We need to, if we care about animal welfare, we need to be smart in our protection of animals. Because yes, maybe you give up meat, but actually you using the microphone or throwing out your microphone instead of repairing it causes more damage than, let's say, the entire year of you giving up meat. It depends. It depends on all sorts of factors. But it's like, again, I'm not trying to get anybody upset. Like, in a Gramscian fashion, I need to bring Gramsci over, because I keep referring to Gramsci, and he's with me. He's with me all the time. It's like I have two things I always carry around: Gramsci and the Standard Model of Particle Physics. Okay, this is me. If I could place him somewhere, I would, but I'm afraid maybe he'll fall down. Okay, let's see if this maybe works to some extent at least, so that Antonio is with us. So it's like everybody, again, we have common interest, males and females, blacks and whites, Christians and Muslims. It's like we all, humans and animals, we have a common interest. Let's work together towards this common interest. Okay. Sorry. I still have not defined interest. I'm going to get there. But let me proceed with this picture, right? So there's free and equal discussion. There's patrimonialism, there's capitalism, there's also state bureaucracy, which is maybe, state bureaucracy has something to do with state capitalism. Again, I'm not trying, this is a draft for my lectures in September. I'm going to think this over, but something like that, right? So this flame wars, tribal passions, but maybe flame wars and tribal passions, this is a subcategory of irrational passions. So Max Weber actually gives the example of charismatic authority of how certain people, Lenin is one example that's often given, right? Some people have this force of charisma, and through the sheer force of charisma, they hypnotize people, sometimes crowds, into doing their bidding. Freud has something to say about this, and the Freud or Marxist people like Marcuse would talk about this as well. There's this erotic element to politics, right? Desires, but the idea is that we have all sorts of irrational passions, and you see, I'm getting to the interest, right? So when we talk about interest, I'm kind of switching between these two slides, right? You need to, so it's like on the one hand, Epicurus and Mill are gonna say, and actually I think the Buddha would agree with them, are gonna say, look, we do not know what are capital V values. But we naturally we want to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. The Buddha says this. The Buddha says this too. Okay, I'm talking and Gramsci is invisible, but you can understand. Gramsci is somewhere over here. Sorry. Yeah. So the Buddha says we all have a practical problem that we suffer. I should make a whole separate video on cognitive behavioral therapy. Because I feel, again, reading Socrates, reading Plato, reading Epicurus, reading Nietzsche and Freud, always makes me want to think about cognitive behavioral therapy, because there's a certain way in which cognitive behavioral therapy is a wonderful tool for students, for people in general, but especially for students, something I recommend to students, in order to help us understand ourselves better and improve our lives. Again, philosophy should be to the soul what medicine is to the body, and for me, cognitive behavioral therapy is a constant with that. I also have another topic I want to talk about, because I feel that there's a certain big overlap between psychology and philosophy. So there's a wonderful course by Carney and Bradbury, and this is a book which is based on this course. And they are both psychologists. One of them is a clinical psychologist, the other one is a social psychologist. This book, it is about intimate relationships, but it is beautiful in terms of how its methodology of how do we explain human behavior. Sorry, it's a digression, but it's an IOU. So, like, the reason I'm talking about this is because I wanna say that we begin by saying that there's pleasure and pain, but human psyche is very complicated, and so exactly how do you navigate this pleasure and pain is not a simple task. And immediately, human beings, I keep talking about the self. There is no one self. Human beings, in this homeostatic fashion, we are complex systems. So humans are complex systems, and there is internal conflict. Modular theory of the mind from evolutionary psychology. Theory of the mind from the evolutionary psychology is the best attempt I know of trying to bring this around. So it's very interesting. As an example, is genomic conflict. There are genes that you got from your mother, and there are genes that you got from your father, and these genes are in conflict with one another. There's this evolutionary arms race. It would take a whole separate video to explain this in detail, but it's like next time you feel you are torn between two alternatives, to some extent, this may be due to those kinds of even genetic issues, not to mention like in general, right? So, and Freud, Plato very famously talks about three parts of the soul: rational, spirited, and appetitive. And Freud very famously talks about three parts of the soul: the id, ego, and superego, right? And they are in conflict by and large. Nietzsche also has this wonderful metaphor where he talks about that the self is an empty plurality, is an empty tautology. That in fact I don't have one self. There's a multitude of souls battling within me. And again, in terms of this process ontology, it actually it's as if my consciousness dies and is reborn every moment with this internal conflict. And yes, Buddha ideally tries to help us get over this conflict. Again, it's a practical enterprise. This Epicurus male, and my man, the Buddha. Let's have the Buddha in the slide as well. So what I'm driving at is that when I wake up in the morning, I know that the universe is chaos of matter and motion. So nothing is good or evil in and of itself. And there are no capital V values. There is no capital J justice. So I have to ask myself, what should I do? And I also know that there is no capital I interest. So, but I know that pleasure automatically, like immediately feels good, and pain feels bad. So yes, so my ethics is utilitarian, eudaemonist, if you want. And in the absence of, it's not your conscious choice. You wake up in the morning in a certain body, and you find yourselves already, let's say, wanting to have a drink of water, wanting to have a breath of fresh air, wanting to, stand up and, stretch your arms or something like that, right? So this, or maybe you're hungry, or maybe you want to see your friends, right? But all of these desires, you don't choose those desires. You find yourself with those desires. Again, as Brian McGee says, talking about Heidegger, we always already find ourselves emerging from the unconsciousness of early morning, and before that, emerging from the unconsciousness of early babyhood, to always already find ourselves thrown into this world without a manual, but with a certain set of capacities, abilities, but also very importantly desires. And it's like, at the end of the day, this is the difference between interest and whims. Interest and whims. Right? A whim is just some random thing that you want to do now. An interest is you thought about this and you're trying to maximize your well-being over the long run. And interest involves foregoing immediate temptations, forego immediate temptation for the sake of overall reward. Well, you understand. And it's like, and you see, it's not, I want to say, it's still a calculus of pleasure and pain. Because let's say I need to go to the dentist, right? It's not like, I want to sacrifice my well-being now for the sake of my well-being in the future. No. I am a rational human being. I have the power of foresight. I understand that if I don't go to the dentist now, I will feel tremendous pain tomorrow. So it is more painful for me now to not go to the dentist because the anticipation of future pain tomorrow causes me a different kind of pain, a certain kind of anxiety, and it's uncomfortable for me to, bear with this anxiety. It's like another example I give when we talk about John Stuart Mill. Again, this notion that a firefighter, it is more painful for a firefighter to run away. It is more painful for them to run away than to rush into a burning building and risk their lives. It's more painful for them to run away than to risk their life. It's less painful for them to risk their life. So there's a certain tautological, psychological egoism underlying all of this. But it's okay because we have common interest. So egoism and altruism need not be opposed. But this is very important for me. Again, a nature of obligation. Whenever we talk about obligations, we have to appeal to individual interest. And again, this is why free and equal discussion is so important. Because at the end of the day, when I say you should quit smoking, what I mean, if you can help it, you should quit smoking, right? What I mean is that down the line, you will agree with me. Maybe right now you don't think so, but down the line, you will, after the fact, you will agree with me. So it's like, try for yourself. And the reason why I'm confident that quitting smoking is a good idea in general is because human nature is common enough. If you were an alien, I don't know, maybe you would need smoking in order to survive. But, human beings, as far as we can, research tells us it's horrible, right? But then, of course, when you say to somebody, give up smoking or give up sugar, that's the thing. Human beings are irrational. Human beings are bundles of coping mechanisms. This very delicate balance between pleasure and pain. This is why I talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. This is why I talked about Carney and Bradbury psychology. It's difficult, because we are bundles of coping mechanisms. So it's like you're gonna give up smoking, but giving up smoking is stressful, and so maybe your life is gonna get worse as you're quitting smoking. Or like diet, when people restructure, forget about vegetarianism or veganism. When simply restructuring your diet to have a more healthy diet, very often. I think that there's research to back this up, that most people who go on a diet end up gaining weight instead of losing weight. It's like, if it's not broken, maybe don't fix it. Because, taking care of yourself is a full-time job. This is what I keep telling my students. And again, when people ask me, why do you do philosophy, especially this kind of philosophy? Because it's luxury. If you can afford it, go for it. So many people cannot afford it. And this is why, again, incidentally, this is also my Marxist sentiment. I don't think that people are idiots. I don't think that people are bad. People find themselves in bad circumstances, and Hobbes agrees. People find themselves in bad circumstances, and they're forced to do these stupid things, harm themselves and harm others. But it's at the end of the day, it's not their fault. It's not even the fault of the CEOs of tobacco companies that they did this thing. Because it's, again, there's a certain quasi-evolutionary kind of logic. It's coercive laws of competition in the market. If the CEO of a particular tobacco company, even if they, out of the kindness of the heart, decides not to abuse their clients, they just go out of job. The company fires them and gets somebody else. There's, these selection mechanisms, selection pressures. Anyway, so this is me to some extent talking about interest, right? So this is how I would define human individual interest. And again, for Foucault, especially for later Foucault, I feel it's a very important, difficult question, because you cannot just assume that something is good for human beings, and you can never be sure what's really good for human beings. It's a question of trial and error. Again, taking care of yourself is a full-time job, and also free and equal discussion is a full-time job. This is why I keep talking about the socialism or barbarism. We need a lot of time to take care of ourselves and to take care of each other. And then we will be in a position to do good to ourselves and to do good to others. Because, again, the way things are now, it's like, again, most people's diets, as far as I can tell, are horribly unhealthy. But for most people, it's not in the cards to try to improve their diet, because, it takes maybe a year of full-time effort to I'm speaking from personal experience, to restructure your diet in a healthy fashion. Because, again, human beings are bundles of coping mechanisms and bundles of habits. This is also very important, and let me definitely add this to the slide, because some of our pleasures and pains are natural, but some of our pleasures and pains are socially induced. So natural plus socially conditioned. So it's like, the fact that the overwhelming, sorry, let me take a sip of water. The fact that the overwhelming majority of anatomically normal human beings find the taste of sugar pleasurable is a natural fact of our biology. The fact that the overwhelming majority of anatomically normal humans find, let's say, rotting meat festering with maggots disgusting is, again, an anatomical fact of our biology. But the fact that, for example, I don't know, I like Hobbes' writing style is, to a very large extent, socially conditioned, right? Or that the firefighter finds it painful to run away. That's clearly socially conditioned. So it's like you cannot simply rely on human passions, right? Human passions need to be enlightened. Right? Through this free and equal discussion, again, human beings are linguistic and therefore social and therefore historical. Human beings are born underdeveloped. This is what Rousseau calls perfectibility. We are imperfect. That's why we're perfectible. We're underdeveloped, unfinished. Right? Society needs to fill in the blanks. Right? And society can do this in a good way or in a bad way. Because just to say, this causes me discomfort, therefore it's bad. That may or may not be true. Again, like if you have a toothache, probably the discomfort is really telling you something that that your life is bad. And you should do something about it. You should change it. But also society can condition you. It's like xenophobia or homophobia, right? These are socially conditioned responses, and people have strong emotional reactions. But these reactions can be rewired. And again, like sometimes, let's say. Going to the doctor and getting a shot, something like that, or I don't know, like doing a blood test. That's also painful. But society conditions us to endure that pain for our interest. Again, sometimes society can condition us to do horrible things to ourselves and to our fellow human beings and even to animals. That's the problem. Human beings are unfinished. So, and this is what the project of John Stuart Mill and of Karl Marx and of everybody, but of Mill especially, right? That we have all sorts of automatic reactions, immediate automatic moral appraisals. This is morally good. This is morally bad. Some of them are maybe good. Some of them are maybe completely wrong. The only valid judge is true, rational, long-term interest. But we can only find that out, common interest, but we can only find it out through free and equal discussion. So having said all that, with respect to animals, animals are incapable of free and equal discussion. If they were, if tomorrow it turns out that we can talk to dolphins or chimpanzees, excellent, welcome to the club. But last time I checked, they're incapable of free and equal discussion. So it's like there is no easy way for me to shoehorn them into this whole picture. So my argument for animal welfare from last time came from the fact that, again, that enjoying gratuitous violence is not something that a well-ordered society should encourage in their children. This is maybe such an important phrase that let me write this. So enjoying gratuitous violence is not something a well-ordered society should encourage in its children. And notice. I'm not talking about rights, natural God-given rights. I'm not talking about suffering, and I'm not talking about consciousness. You see, to me, the question of whether animals are conscious and to what extent they can feel pain is, I may be wrong, but I feel it's completely beside the point. I feel it's completely beside the issue. Imagine you give your child a very realistic robot who simulates a cat, and your child begins to violently torture this robotic toy. Okay, the toy that cannot feel pain, the toy is unconscious, but still, there's something disturbing and wrong about the proclivity of your child to do such a thing. Or imagine, playing some kind of vile video game and enjoying gratuitous violence. That might not necessarily be a good thing. And again, the characters in the game are presumably unconscious. So you see, like to me, capacity to feel pain and capacity for consciousness have nothing to do with the question of animal rights or animal welfare. Again, there are weeds, there are problematic questions, but I don't want to talk about them because you see, this is Gramsci. The Communist Party, the Communist movement is the new prince. You see, me and the animal welfare activists, we have 90% of our goals in common. And then if the rest 10% we diverge, that's fine. We'll talk about this once we get 90% of the way there. Okay? It's like imagine you have a patient and they go into a hospital and they're having a heart attack, right? But instead of treating their heart attack, you look at the pimple on their forehead. Like to me, when black workers fight against white workers for who has just slightly tiny bit larger wage, for me that's like worrying about a pimple on the forehead of a patient who's having a heart attack. See, like again, our system is so broken, and humanity is going to hell with our nuclear weapons, and and with the fact that we're not doing a very good job of protecting ourselves from pandemics. Or again, like late Stephen Hawking, I have Hawking's book. I feel somewhere over here. Yeah, late Stephen Hawking used to say that he thinks that the biggest underappreciated threat to human species is meteor strikes. If he's right, we're not spending nearly enough money on nearly enough resources on trying to rectify that. So let's get 90% of the way, and then if we have disagreements, okay, maybe free and equal discussion. Maybe at the end of the day we'll have to agree to disagree on some points. But I feel that we have such an overwhelming consensus on the really important issues that all of this small stuff doesn't need to be taken into consideration. Okay, yeah. Also, I have this talking about human irrationality and the fact that how this whims and rational long-term self-interest. Yeah, Daniel Kahneman has this is a wonderful book. Talks about all the ways in which human individuals are actually not in a very good position to understand what's actually good for them. But that's why you cannot just trust people to tell you what you think is right, what you think is good, right? It takes critical reflection and philosophy. It's like self-interest needs to be enlightened by philosophy. So that's an interesting slide. I think one other thing I wanted to talk about. So I kind of talked about many of these things. Let me mention a word about the general will. So it's like, you see, I keep talking about common interest, and I want to say it's like common interest is the standpoint of the general will, and often students are skeptical about that and cynical about that. So general will, true rational common interest. And you see, and Hegel, when Hegel talks about the Volksgeist, he talks about something very similar. Volksgeist, spirit of the nation in Hegel. So Rousseau and Hegel. And actually Marx and all the rest of them, right? But what I'm driving at is like, it's like basically the question I'm trying to ask is general will rhetoric, is the general will rhetoric just dangerous and abusive, in the sense that, because very often students I feel like that, right? How do you know? How can you know? How can another person know better than you what's good for you? Or how can a private person know what's best for all society? How can you know what's best for me, right? And basically the immediate thing I want to say is that this happens all the time. We assume that this happens all the time. For example, we assume that parents know better than children what's good for the children. And I always like the medical model, right? We assume that the doctor knows better for you what is good for you, right? And so a psychologist or a psychiatrist sometimes can know better for you what's going to make you happy, what's going to make you less depressed or more happy, less unhappy, right? I feel that the Buddha knows much better than most individuals on how to make our lives less full of suffering, right? But then, like from a rhetorical perspective, I want to say this happens very often, right? So again, so this is me trying to talk about the Volksgeist, the spirit of the nation, right? In Hegel, right? So specifically, my example is the idea of a jury trial. I've actually taken part in a jury trial. I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to by law to discuss the details, and maybe I'll do a separate video about that. It was actually a very sobering experience because I was much younger and I was much more pessimistic about capacity of random human beings from the street to judge court cases. But I came out deeply surprised. Just it blew my mind how self-conscious and how responsible my fellow jurymen were, and these were just random people off the street. And I have to confess, I had on the first day we met, I had some, I don't want to say contempt But I was looking down on them because I'm university educated, etc. And it's bad, okay? I should apologize to them, and I feel bad about that. I feel sorry that I felt contempt for them. But again, in the course of our jury trial, I was amazed on how good a job they did. You don't have to trust me, and maybe I'm wrong. And this is just one particular jury trial in which I have taken part. So mileage may vary, but this is so you understand. The example, a single anecdote never proves anything. An observation of, one observation has 0 degrees of freedom, statistically speaking. But the point is, again, in the jury trial, there was actually a group of criminals. Well, there was a group of accused. I'm not sure if they were criminals or not. Let's be skeptical. It's an important part of the jury trial. Don't jump to conclusions. So there are several defendants, and notice, the jury were not asked, like, what do you want? Like, what do you personally want to be done with these people? What would satisfy your whims, right? This is not the question that's asked to the jury. Or let's say, what is in your immediate self-interest? Should these people go to prison, or should these people go free, right? The jury is asked to occupy this position, linguistically speaking, right? Whether you believe we're good at this or not, we have the capacity to employ this general use of reason, public use of reason. Public use of reason. The question is it right? I suppose from the standpoint of the general will, again, of the common interest, is it right that people like these, in these circumstances, on balance of evidence, is it right that these kinds of people should go to prison or not? Are they guilty or not objectively? You see, as a jury, you're trying to make that decision. Or again, ideally, as a politician, you are saying, I think this is good for Germany or for Belgium or for Congo, or I think it's bad for Germany, for Belgium, or for Congo. Not for me personally, but for the state. And you could say, well, but how can we trust individuals? Yeah, and you're right to be skeptical. Human beings are irrational. We lie to ourselves and we lie to others. And we very often do not know what's good for ourselves, much less we can predict what's good for societies. All of these things are true. But the Habermas's insight is that we have to try. And again, think about this in terms of ideal types, right? So it's like the general will may be served. Yeah. So, and I want to say that the general will is going to give you the free and equal discussion. General will. The question is, to what percentage? What is the percentage of decisions that you make in society? Or what is the percentage of, you understand, to what extent is your society governed by free and equal discussion, which genuinely arrives at the general will? And to what percentage is it patrimonialism and nepotism? To what extent is it just coercive laws of competition in the market? To what extent is this, the logic of bureaucracy? This is also very much due to Weber. And to what extent is this just irrational passions, or people falling for charisma, right? But I feel very important. It's not an on-off switch. It's a sliding scale. And because it's a sliding scale, it's very useful to think about the idealized situation. Nobody ever finds themselves in a condition of completely, free and equal discussion. It never happens. It doesn't exist, spherical cow in a vacuum. But you can try to approach it. Again, Hegel has this wonderful metaphor. No human being is perfectly healthy. But the doctor has an idealized vision of perfect health. And it's useful to have this idealized vision because it allows you to give prescriptions to individual human beings who are all less than healthy. So a political philosopher needs to have an idealized vision of what perfectly healthy, perfectly well-ordered society looks like in order to give advice to particular societies and particular individuals. Okay. And I kind of went through my entire plan. I could talk more about Marx, because for Marx, there's a very interesting question about how our common interest actually has to be global common interest. And this is kind of an interesting issue between Rousseau, Hegel, and Marx, because Rousseau and Hegel are mostly thinking in national terms, but Marx is thinking in international terms. But as you remember, I insist that Marx has a certain kind of global nationalism, global cosmopolitan nationalism, because the Workers' International, has certain important, element of civic nationalism. The class in itself becomes class for itself. Workers actually understand themselves as a nation, and you need a party. You need an international party. Gramsci would say. At least, I'm not saying that Marx had all the right answers, or that Gramsci had all the right answers. But these are, I feel, that interesting directions into which we think. Okay. So, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to take a peek at the chat before I do. So, yeah. BC, greetings, BC, says that she likes the argument about 90%, having 90% in common, going 90% and then the rest of the way. Yeah, I feel it's like, because again, you see, free and equal discussion, it's an ideal type. We're never going to have 100% perfect agreement. This is so to some extent we need to agree to disagree. But this is the reason. Again, it's like, and that's the problem, because I don't want to conceal the fact that I'm a Marxist. I don't want to conceal it because that would be dishonest. But on the other hand, I'm not trying to convert anybody to Marx, right? And I'm not a dogmatic Marxist by any means, right? But I feel this is for me the core of Marx's notion. Again, especially in German ideology, how Marx writes that communists do not demand that people sacrifice themselves for one another. But in communism, there's going to be no difference between altruism and egoism. And I feel, again, you see, scientific versus utopian socialism, I feel that to some extent, we already live in communism. Again, me giving this lecture, this is hopefully helpful for me, but this is also hopefully helpful for you. It's like, I'm not sacrificing anything to give this lecture. And you are not sacrificing anything, hopefully, to listen to this lecture. Right? So it's a win-win situation. Like, one tide lifts all the boats. And human nature is such, especially because human beings are malleable, human nature is open-ended, because we have a huge capacity for, not the zero-sum prisoner's dilemma, but enabling each other. Oh yeah, and Kartoffel Mandan talks about Apple. The company that produces. Yeah, so it's like when people, again, please, colleagues, I don't want to upset anybody, but when people say that the most impactful thing you can do in terms of your carbon footprint is to give up meat, I'm like, maybe the most impactful thing you can do is maybe skip buying the next iPhone, because what's the carbon footprint of that? Sorry. I'm not an expert. I'm not sure. Let's be smart about this. But again, to me, it's not a question of me having been shamed into this position. But what I'm driving at is I feel that all this stuff I have around me, again, this microphone, it comes with a price that's measured in blood, in human blood and in animal blood. And I think it's irresponsible for me not to understand that, right? And I feel that talking about this general will, I am trying to occupy this position in my head. I'm trying to, like a physicist is trying to imagine a complicated physical model. So as a political philosopher, I am trying to imagine the standpoint of the nation as a whole, or the standpoint of humanity as a whole. And to me, I understand it's a compromise. It's less than perfect solution. I would much rather prefer if our whole system, systematic problems require systematic solutions. I would much rather prefer that our system be organized in a much more rational fashion so that I could do my job and I could enjoy life without destroying the environment. Because at the end of the day, I don't feel that I need to destroy the environment in order to do my job. Because again, talking about whims, etc., John Stuart Mill talks about this. Actually, again, no. This is actually important. This is very important. Conspicuous consumption. Should I add this to the slide? Ethical. It's like ethical consumption, conspicuous consumption. Ethical consumption. Conspicuous consumption. I mean, not to mention nuclear weapons, okay? So it's like, I'm talking in terms of impact. So conspicuous consumption is a phrase that is due to Thorsten Veblen, and actually, at least in my experience, picked up by Jean Baudrillard, especially with his Baudrillard's idea of, I think it's Société du Spectacle, right? Society of Spectacle, or is it Guy Debord? Yeah, it's probably Guy Debord. Consumer Society, I forget. Baudrillard has a very famous book. And Baudrillard there talks about conspicuous consumption, and he talks about how you can also, ethical consumption, frugality, and ethical consumption can also be conspicuous. Again, this is the idea from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this notion of amour propre. When people are distinction between being and seeming, right? When we consumer choice, whatever. So when we it's like, again, imagine you're buying food for yourself, which will nourish you, or imagine you're buying food that you want to impress others with, or you're buying clothing which is going to be functional, or you're buying clothing like with brands all over so that you want other people to envy you, right? Or buying a car that you want other people to envy you. So when we talk about ethical consumption, I feel that addressing these kinds of issues maybe is a much more important notion. And again, capitalism thinks issues such as it's like capitalism. Because capitalism, let's say, plus imperialism. So you have nuclear weapons, defense spending, you have planned obsolescence. And also this again, consumer culture, like taking young children and brainwashing them into this, consume. Like you have an iPhone from last year. Oh, you must be a loser. You see, like this kind of mindset. So it's like, I feel that the goal is clear. How we get there now, I'm not saying that that's clear. Okay, it's you see, this is the easy part. The easy part is a political philosopher saying common interest. Let's get there. But how do you create how do we as humanity pull ourselves by our hair, by our bootstraps? How do we start the free and equal discussion among the people who are not free and not equal, right, and who are poor and overworked? How do and then how does the free and equal discussion actually find the measures that are going to get us from where we are to a hopefully consensual future? These can be very difficult questions. So I think that the philosophical, like the political philosophical issue is simple, but the putting it into practice is extremely complex. Again, when I say socialism or barbarism, again, I'm always reminded of how Karl Marx actually in the first paragraph of Communist Manifesto talks about how class struggle ends in the victory of the progressive class or the common ruin of the contending classes. And it's so much easier to understand, to imagine the common ruin of humanity in 2021, unfortunately. But Gramsci, please help us out. Yeah, pessimism of the intellect, definitely pessimism of the intellect. But let's try to keep up the optimism of the will. Common ruin is gemeinsamen Untergang, I think. Anyway, colleagues, I think I'm gonna wrap this up here. So I hope this was fun. I hope this was stimulating. Again, I hope that this is again one small test case for communism at work. One tide lifts all boats. Win-win situation. So thank you very much for your company, and until next time, stay safe and take care.